Hello, Jimmy. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Oh man, it's so great to be on the show. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always good. It's been a while, but I think I've had you between this and ADD Masterminds. It feels like you're on all the time, but like it's been a
I
while
mean,
since we've
I'm
done a
starting.
Wax Museum episode. I think. Eh?
Yeah, I think so. I'm still waiting for the checks on the ADD Mastermind.
Oh yeah, the Acme checks.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Acme wasn't paying anymore, and so that's why we got rid of them.
Oh man, yeah. I hate having those sponsors that never pay out.
Little inside baseball on you. How the sausage is made, and I'm gonna mix all the metaphors at once. So the reason why I had you on is like we actually had that really fun kind of discussion on Messenger or on Facebook rooms, and we started talking a bit about idolatry and kind of the idolatry that happens. And I thought American Idols was a good title for it, but this definitely applies to Canadians too. We try to pretend we're
Did,
better,
did
but like, we got some of the same issues.
we had the American Idol TV show here? Did you guys have Canadian Idol
There
with
is a
Simon Cowell?
Canadian Idol, yeah. Not Simon Cowell. I don't
Oh,
even remember who judged it, but like, yeah.
Alanis Morissette.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm like, I don't care. I probably know people who've tried out for Canadian Idol, but I wouldn't be
Yeah,
interested in trying out for one of those shows. I'm good.
I knew somebody who was actually a really good singer, and she tried out for American Idol, and she didn't even make it past the initial screening.
Dang.
It's weird because she was actually really good.
I entered a karaoke contest once, and yeah, I didn't do well. So, anyways, all right. So we're thinking about like what, and I think we kind of started by talking politically and talking about the idols that people have, which we'll get to in a bit. But I think kind of the first one I wanted to talk about is comfort. Comfort acts as an idol. It's really what hinders us from doing what God's calling us to do, doesn't it? Or isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we seek comfort above all things sometimes. It seems like, our career choices and uh,
Hmm.
our choices for a spouse and what we want to do for fun, a lot of that has to do with, being comfortable at the end of the day, right?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, career wise, I want to be comfortable. So I'm going to take a job that will allow me to live comfortably.
So you're going to become a podcaster.
Yeah. Oh, could you imagine? Could you imagine doing this full time? Awesome.
Yeah, I imagine it all the time. But I'm sitting there underwriting mortgages. I'm like, how can I have my microphone less than 6 feet away from me. And I'm like all the time looking at it like, how can I make money off of that?
Don't you think though that like what you do for a living informs your podcasting?
A little bit. I bring a little bit of that to the table for sure.
Because like for me, I travel a lot, and so it kind of forces me to like, um, it forces me to see things from different perspectives because I'm dealing with different people all the time in different places, and it's really the nature of what I do now is trying to understand different points of view on things. Okay, so that's comfort. I mean, beyond just career too. Like, it's just generally speaking, if someone says, "Why don't you go feed the homeless? Why don't you go work at the soup kitchen?" You're like, my bed seems more comfortable.
Right.
So, I mean, I think this is one that we can all identify with as an idol. Um,
Absolutely.
my second one is self. And I think it's very, very easy for us to allow self to get in the way of everything, which I guess is similar to comfort.
Right. That self is causing us to seek out comfort and a lot of the other things that we seek when we seek out idols.
I feel like a lot of these run together because personal liberty is another one,
Right.
which is something only Americans care about, right?
Well, I mean, in Canada, you guys don't even have constitutional rights. So,
We have a constitution.
yeah, but not rights, though. You guys we don't know what we can get away with doing.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. No, we have like a charter of rights and freedoms. Don't
Oh,
ask
do
me to
you?
quote any of it.
Right. That's how important it is. But every American can tell you about the right of the freedom of speech and not to have their the press to be infringed, gun rights to be infringed, freedom of religion,
Yeah.
freedom to kill babies.
Yeah. There you go. Personal liberty. Personal liberty is such an interesting one because I actually, there's a guy that owns the building that I work at. And he said something to me that I've like has stuck in my mind ever since. He said, "Your right to pollute should not infringe on my right to clean air." And I'm
Mm.
like, that's interesting. And I mean, it's the same to Josh Schumann. He posted. It's either he posted it or he said this on my podcast once. He said, "My right to swing my fist ends where your face begins."
Right.
And so I'm
Yep.
like, I like those kinds of, explanations for what personal liberty is. And I think that's maybe the idea behind personal liberty is that I can have personal liberty as long as it doesn't start infringing on yours.
Right.
And when I did the capitalism podcast with Brad Walker, that was something he mentioned is like liberty for every person. And it's like personal right. And personal rights, should overrule everything. And the interesting thing about that is that like he was saying that why does that word escape me every time? But like the idea of being kind to others, and loving others more than myself, um, that is something he says should not be of value. Personal liberty should be everything. But the thing is like if my personal liberty is important, I also have to value your personal liberty. So basically you end up loving your neighbor as yourself in theory,
In
if
theory.
we actually do it right. But I think this is something where personal liberty is probably better for those who have more influence within a society or power under the sun. Oh my gosh, we're segueing. So
Good.
that's another idol is obtaining power under the sun.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you look at the politicians and they say, they're supporting some sort of policy idea or value or something like that. But at the end of the day, they get in office and then they do nothing or very little, next to nothing, to actually support that idea. And they kind of take a different perspective all of a sudden once they get power. But then they can't, when an election comes around again, they dangle that in front of their people like, well, I'm all for your right to own guns and to worship God and, not have to wear a mask. Ha 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 ha, and they use that to get you to vote for them. Or they say, I'm against abortion. And they say that, but then they, don't ever do anything about abortion when they actually get to office. And but it's great to be on that power trip and to find people who are willing to always give them more power.
Well, you're looking for the politician that will give you the power under the sun, right? In most
Right.
cases. Yeah. Significance is a big one for me that I
Gosh, that's
really worked through.
everybody wanting to dream big.
Yeah. I want to be significant.
I want to leave a
And
legacy.
yeah, leave a legacy, make a big impact, get lots of followers on the Twitter.
All right. Look at those pyramids in Egypt. I mean, those guys definitely wanted to leave something for everybody to remember them by and to live forever. And they did a pretty good job at some of that. And we still have those buildings over there today, even though, they got destroyed in Noah's flood. But no, we do those things to leave a legacy, to build a name for ourselves, to build a ministry, to build a kingdom, to build a nation. And everything is towards that.
Yeah, and I mean that significance can also be something within the kingdom of God and saying like, God, I want to lead like 1,000,000 people to you. That's
Right.
what's going to please God. When in reality, it's like, well, that's not how you please God. You please
Right.
God through obedience. It's not through metrics.
Right. Well, nobody wants to live their life and feel like they were a waste of a life, that they didn't leave anything of significance behind for the next generation and for the people immediately around them. So we in order to, fight against this sort of nihilism where we feel like everything's meaningless, and I am just a speck of grain in the sand. We don't want to have that sense of nothingness about our lives, because we know how hard life is, and we want to imagine that life is much more than working for the man, paying the bills, taking care of the kids, and producing the next generation of human beings to inherit the earth. And we think, man, is that all there is in this life? To work hard, to toil, to pay some bills and help somebody else make some money, and survive. Surely there has to be more to life than this, and we don't want to feel that sort of futility, and that sense of meaningless. So we try to bring significance. We try to discover a calling, a purpose, something that feels bigger than ourselves, because we know if it was just us, that's not very much.
Theology. That's another idol.
I love John Calvin. He's great. he's so dreamy.
I feel like I'm sure I got told actually that I really misrepresent Calvinists.
You probably do.
Sure I do. It just doesn't make sense to me. I'm like,
right. Most people misrepresent the things that they don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
And whether intentional or not,
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, for me, I wouldn't say I'm like married to certain theologies.
Right.
Like, I'm still kind of like, I don't know. I'm listening. Although I think it's hard to listen to Calvinism. Like, I'm just like, what, God predetermines everybody? Like, so there's just supposed to be haves and have-nots, and that's the way God wants it to be?
I think it depends who's selling it. Like, I could probably, if Tim Keller was selling me Calvinism, I could drink Calvinism all day long. If somebody a little bit more heavy-handed and fundamentalist, let's say like an Albert Mohler or John MacArthur, if they're trying to sell me Calvinism, I'm going to reject Calvinism all day long. But if Tim Keller wanted to preach me some Calvinism, I'd listen to him all day.
All right. Money. That's a pretty obvious idol. But I think we make all kinds of sacrifices for money, don't we?
Absolutely. But with money comes power. With money, like it or not, comes sex. Those things make the world go around at the end of the day, and we recognize the interconnectedness of everything. I used to joke when I worked at the law firm and I was making all of $12 an hour working in the mailroom. I was like, man, if I could just find a job that paid $10,000 more, I'd be $10,000 more attractive. And that was kind of my joke, because I was very broke at the time. I could barely afford to keep myself alive, let alone go on dates.
Yeah.
And I recognized, hey, what girl is going to want to be with me? I mean, I may be like the greatest looking guy in the world, but they're not going to look at me as a serious long-term prospect. Oh, my light just went out. Crap. Anyway, the show will go on. But they're not going to look at me with a serious long-term prospect if I can't, at least afford some basic things in life. And so it was my running joke that the only reason I was single is because I wasn't $10,000 more attractive. And then when I did actually get a better job and was making more than $10,000 more a year, I was like, man, if I just make $10,000 more, I'll be married. And sure enough, that next $10,000, I met my wife.
Wow.
And so that was kind of an ironic sort of joke, but there's something very real about the pursuit of money and how it, impacts our ability to do things in this world. And it definitely becomes something of an idol that we relentlessly pursue because we understand its magic-like, divine-like abilities.
And I think we see with capitalism is that it can become a religion of profit at all costs.
Right.
It was really interesting. I heard somewhere that there was like an experiment someone did where they would like mail like a check for like $5, but they sent it to like the biggest billionaires in the New York area. And there was something like, I'm just making up numbers at this point, but there was something like 10 billionaires that actually cashed that check. And they kept going down until they got to like, I think it was like $1 or something, or it might have been 75 cents. And when they got down to 75 cents, I think there were like 2 New York billionaires that still cashed it at 75 cents. And Donald Trump was one of them. I'm like, that's
Oh,
insanity. Yeah. But
wow.
it's like, that's how you get rich. Like, that's how if you really want to be the best of the best with money, it gets to a point where you're penny pinching like mad.
Right.
And so that's insanity. All right. Wokeism. Now there's a bunch of stuff that comes under that. But I think wokeism as an idol is a really interesting thing, because I think like you start out by thinking, I care about this group of people. I care about the LGBTQ community. I care about the oppressed minorities, the people of color. But it can become an idol in itself when, you know, the fact that you can show to everybody on Twitter just how woke you are, it's becoming a bit of an idol.
Absolutely. You know, I don't even think, even with wokeism, sometimes it just boils down to our identities. You know, however whatever demographic we allow to prevail with our identity, whether it is as a social justice warrior who is, you know, sitting there listening to gay Black people tell their story so that you can be an ally, you know,
Yeah.
you can pride yourself on that. Or, you know, whether you are one of those Black people who are using their, you know, racial identity to, you know, inform everything about them. Like, I'll never forget, there was this online discussion I had years ago. It was wild. It was this self-professed woman who said she was a Black female apostle. And when you went to her webpage, it screamed, "I'm a Black female apostle." And I actually got to talking to her, and she wouldn't actually be quiet about the entire "I'm a Black female apostle" thing. And I was like, you know what you need to do to get saved? You need to give up this entire "I'm a Black female apostle" thing, because your entire identity is built into this sense of "I'm a Black female apostle." And that's about the only thing I've been able to hear from you. Everything has centered around your identity as a Black female apostle. And I was like, maybe you are Black, maybe you are a woman, maybe you are an apostle. I don't know. You're just somebody I'm talking to online. But, you know, there was this very sense at which this became her calling card, and that everything she was about her skin color, her title in the church, and her gender. And I kind of found that kind of scary, because you know, she may have been a Black female apostle. I don't know. You know, whatever your views on apostles are. So I know most people probably don't believe in modern day apostles, but I've hung out with some charismatic folks who definitely believe they are such. And, you know, we can allow that to become our everything and become our idol, and we demand other people bow down to it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the interesting thing with race too is that, like, I'm Gen X. I'm you know, a child of the 90s, and my generation was like, I don't see color. And that's how we dealt with racism. And then, you know, kind of the new kind of wokeism is kind of saying, no, you need to see color.
Right.
You need to see color and understand that as a white person, you have privilege that people of color do not have. And on the extreme end of things, you know, you have people who are kneeling before Black Lives Matter protesters and saying, I renounce my white privilege, which I'm like, I don't really understand how that works. I don't see how that could not be anything but virtue signaling.
Right. Because guess what? You get to still walk into a store and people see the white guy. You can renounce your privilege all you want, but, you know, the retail clerk's not going to follow you around all of a sudden because you've renounced your white privilege.
Exactly. And so, like, to me, it's like, if anything, you know, if I can recognize that somebody who's got a different sexual identity, a different sexuality, a different color of skin, when I can recognize that and say, you know what, this person has a different experience than
Absolutely.
I do.
Yes.
And for me to look at that person and say, this is how I think you should be Black. This is how I think you should live as a gay person. This is
Right.
how I think you should live as a person who is triggered every time someone uses the wrong pronoun. You know, like I don't know. I don't know how to do any of that. So I want to spend more time listening
Sure.
and trying to tell people. And I think, you know, like there is something, you know, if you really want to be an activist, I think rather than saying, I'm going to stand up for these people, I think a better thing to do is to try to help people's voices be heard. People from those communities, help them let their voices be heard. I don't know if I worded that right, but like do what you can to amplify those voices, because I think that's far better than, you know, white bridge mansplaining everything to people, right? And I mean, like, it's like, what do I know? I don't know much. And that's why, you know, I prefer to have, you know, a woman come on my podcast to talk about women in ministry, because like,
Right.
what do I know, right? And so I think that I think amplifying, you know, those voices that are talking about these issues that I don't have a clue about is a much better place to be than for me to say, I'm going to stand up for all these people, you know, because I mean, I think you have a bit of a white savior complex when you feel like you're the one that has to explain all this stuff, when you could
Right.
just simply find a great, you know, a person who's in that community and retweet them. But I mean, I know that's not as nice as you using the right words. And I think the condemnation of other people too, I think you have to be careful how we do that. Like I think it's good to call out bad behavior, but I think doing it in such a way that it's like, I'm going to just show everybody how much of a warrior I am by taking this guy
Right.
down is like, hmm.
Yeah, there's
Oh, like I feel
what's
like a lot of this is like learning to not be distracted by your own reflection.
absolutely. But I mean, so many people want to build themselves a platform, and they want to build themselves a platform as the person who, you know, gave the opportunity to somebody, as you know, as you say, that white savior.
It is. It's the new white savior complex.
Right.
And I mean, like, I think, you know, one thing that I'm really interested in is this notion of white supremacy, because if you look at those people that are still stuck in the 90s, they're like, well, white supremacy is saying that I'm better because I'm white. But I think the new view of white supremacy is saying that like Euro normative, I don't even, I'm not even using the right words. How woke am I? But it's like this idea that like kind of a Eurocentral culture is superior to any other culture. Therefore, we have to get everybody to act and look as European as possible. And you can see
Right.
that even in style, you know, of how you know, like Black women were told to wear their hair a certain way and try, you know, it's like, huh, you know,
Right.
and everybody trying to look as white as possible. And it's like our culture has done that instead of celebrating our differences and seeing what we can like actually celebrate from the different cultures, particularly indigenous culture. Like, my gosh, there's so much good stuff in indigenous culture. And I love that people are actually saying Happy Indigenous Day. You know, like, I don't think you need to condemn people for celebrating Columbus Day. I think you could just decide to celebrate Indigenous Day if you want to.
Yeah, I think the Columbus Day thing is on the way out. I think most people are kind of like, I can't say that without sounding like I'm a racist.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so that's, I guess that's another one actually is the founding fathers. I
Yeah,
feel like there's a certain amount of idolatry that goes into that. And so
absolutely.
like when we talk about like statues and, you know, like, oh my gosh, they're tearing down this statue and now we're not going to remember who George Washington was or whatever. I'm like, I think we'll remember them without the statues. Um, like, I think it's like, why do we need to honor certain people from our history to remember them? Like, I think we can remember them still. And I understand also that it's ridiculous to judge every historic figure by the same standards as today.
Sure.
Like, I don't think that's fair either. But
Well,
I'm
look
like, I
look at
don't
the
know if we
shift that
need.
we've even seen in our own generation, like where in the 90s the thing was to be colorblind,
Yeah,
but now colorblind is racism, and now
yeah,
the thing is to be woke, you know, and to
yeah.
acknowledge gender, and to acknowledge race, and to acknowledge, you know, all the certain intersectional points. And so, you know, 10 years from now, what's going to be the thing that they declare was racist about the present decade? So
Yeah.
kind of a slippery slope when you start doing that. You have to be careful, because
Well,
eventually you're going to burn yourself.
and I think that's part of too what I find interesting about like this whole kind of woke culture is that you're now developing a system where we kind of look at each person and figure out what their identity is based on what groups they fit to.
Right.
And it's like, well, like I think being able to say, well, it was difficult for this person because they have all these things working against them is one thing. But then to like say, well, now we've got to look at this person as a marginalized individual because they belong to these groups. It's like, well, that doesn't always work in practice,
Sure.
because like the white Christian dude that got laid off at his factory job, he's not happy. And that sucks for him.
Right.
And the black gay lawyer who's making good money, you're saying he's marginalized? Like that doesn't
Right.
it doesn't always work, right? But like knowing that that guy's whiteness wasn't something that hindered him over his life, but for that black lawyer, there may have been times where he was hindered by his gender, his sexuality, and his, race, right? So it's like, okay, but it's like, I don't know. I feel like I don't want to ignore identity. I think that's stupid to just like pretend that none of these things exist,
Sure.
but to fixate on them is silly too. And it's kind of like at some point we're kind of like children at the playground that are like, that's a boy and this is a girl. Like, it's like, who cares?
Right.
I would like to be able to treat people like people, um, while recognizing their story may be different. And I'd rather open up that conversation and let them tell me their story rather than assume their story based on the intersectionality of that individual.
Well, so, some of this has to do with a lack of, you know, how we've kind of, when the collectivist mindset always wants to see individuals in light of their demographic points of data, what their
Right,
intersectional qualities are. It,
right,
it, it makes it impossible for them just to be an individual, and it wants to paint individuals with monolithic brushes that are associated with their race or their gender, or, you know, their nation of origin or their religion, or what have you. And we do it in both positive and negative ways, you know, old white men or young black men, and, you know, all the baggage that comes with such perspectives. And you immediately want to paint everybody with that brush, and whatever happened to just hey, here's me, my name's Jimmy. And, you know, it forces us to try to look at everybody through that prism, instead of allowing them to stand out as an individual created in the image of God, who also has this beautiful tapestry of the fact that they're male or female or black or white or, you know, Asian or what have you. And instead of those things being elements of that person's story, it becomes the overarching narrative and makes it impossible almost to see them in their own individual light. Like, you know, people would look at a black Trump supporter and say, "What's wrong with you? You know, don't you know you're black?" And so instead of seeing that individual as an individual who also happens to be black and also
mm,
happens to be a Trump supporter, and people become suspicious and think they must be an Uncle Tom, or they must be a sellout, or, there's some sort of, negative derogatory saying that people will say about people when they don't fit into those neat little boxes, because of those overarching narratives and those points of intersectionality. And yes, those things can be important and can definitely help us understand the complexity of the life an individual who may live. But when we just see people strictly in those terms, I think that's terrorizing in my mind. That is an idol, and that's something that needs to be destroyed thoroughly.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny too, because like you consider like part of being a person of privilege is you don't have to think about your own identity that much, right?
Sure.
Like it's rare that I'm really confronted with my identity in a negative way.
Right.
And if I am confronted with my identity in a negative way, it's usually like, yeah, that's fair. Dudes can be terrible,
Right.
like I do think like the difficulty with manhood though is kind of that mantle that's placed on men, to be, there's a certain level of masculinity you're supposed to live up to, which at some point I just said, yeah, that's stupid. I'm not going to care about that. But a lot of men have identity crises because they're struggling to live up to this level of masculinity that they're supposed to live, and it tends to be kind of put on them by their fellow males,
Right.
fathers, like there's a lot there, and it's like to buck that is difficult. And I think that's been something I've been very conscious of raising boys, to like just try to raise them with this like notion of like, dude, just rock whatever you've got, like
Right.
don't worry about living up to a certain expectation of what masculinity is.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of our gender issues within our society has been based on that. And it's a toxic masculinity, like, and I think, like being able to address toxic masculinity without saying being a male means you're inherently toxic.
Right.
It's like being able to say, well, these are what are typically male characteristics. And it's like, so what do we do with this? How do we use these characteristics in a positive way and not place the expectation on every individual that's born with a penis to be exactly this way?
Right.
But at the same time, to be able to be like, okay, I get it. He went out and he played in a puddle. And that's kind of what boys do. And some girls do it too, but it's more typical for a boy to do that, right? Like it's,
All right.
I don't
Like,
know. Like I just feel like we need to freewheel it a little more and stop building systems for what masculinity should be, because I think that's what a lot of what wokeism is fighting against.
sure.
And it's like there's just been all these structures in place, the patriarchy and all that, right? And it's like, can we just like, again, can we just let people be people? And
Right.
it's like, yeah, but anyways,
Well,
I think that part of your identity can very much become an idol too, because that's a guiding principle. I'm a guy, therefore this is what's expected of me, so I'm going to pattern my life after this. When in reality, I should not be patterning my life after John Wayne. Like that doesn't make sense.
Well, I think you bring up a good point with the cultural expectation, because we might, in one breath say, chide some guy for trying to be a masculine male and stuff like that, and showing overt signs of masculinity and things like that. But if I were to sit there and be a 35-year-old guy living in my parents' basement unemployed, I would even with the most Marxist of folks who are all gender this, that, and the other. If I was a 35-year-old guy living in my parents' basement and I was unemployed, even the most rabid feminist would say that I was a waste of a man. Because I wasn't living up to the basic expectations and norms of that men are supposed to be conquerors and providers and, taking care of their families and stuff like that. If I were, that individual, somebody might say, well, they would chide me if I were to be such an individual. And let's say I was coming against feminism or something. And they were like, well, you're just an unemployed guy that lives in his parents' basement, and as terrible as that might be to be an unemployed 35-year-old male living in your parents' basement, that could not necessarily be fun. And don't recommend it. That's why I prefer being a big bad banker. But it's funny because you'll get smacked if you assert your masculinity, but if you don't live up to still that masculine basic expectations, then you'll be smacked for not being that. And it's kind of a double standard that is held out there, that you can't use your male privilege, but if you fail to be a man, you're going to have to still pay for it.
Well, yeah, manhood's an interesting thing to navigate. And I think, this is why, I've, really tried to get out of my vocabulary, this whole term man up. I like the idea of can we all be adults? I think is a much better way of looking at it, because I think whatever your gender is, whatever your gender identity is, it's I think there's a point where you need to adult up. Right. And you know what? I think sometimes adulting up is to say, you know what? I'm struggling to pay the rent right now, and I'm 35. I lost my job. I'm going to live with my parents in their basement for a bit. And it's Absolutely. That's the right thing to do for you.
Right.
Now, I mean, totally. There's going to be a time period at which it's okay, I'm getting too comfortable with this, right? Maybe, I don't know. I'd hate to be in that situation, but I think a lot of this too is that who is placing these expectations on whom? Right. And it's who has the right to place the expectations on this person? Who has the right to speak into their life? Is really interesting. I just listened to this podcast episode with Preston Sprinkle, and he deals with a lot of sexuality issues. And he was talking to a individual who is gender non-binary. And when he was talking to them, he basically, where the conversation got to is that person was assigned female at birth, right? Which they said, prefer to say that over biologically female, because there are certain people that really are triggered by the biological portion, right? Which that's a whole political whatever, right?
Yeah.
What I found really interesting is they were Preston Sprinkle said, well, what would you say to someone who says they have opinions on how you should deal with your gender dysphoria? And they said, are they my therapist? And it's if it's my therapist, I will take direction from them. But if it's, a family member, if it's a person at my church, if it's a stranger on the street, it's they don't have a right to speak into this situation. I was well, that's really interesting, because even with this, where we've got this guy living in his basement, it's well, who has a right really to speak to that issue? I'm pretty sure the person on Twitter doesn't have that right.
Right.
It's you don't know my situation. So and so I don't know. I'm trying to be, low on my judgment scale of strangers. I don't need to.
That sounds profoundly biblical, John.
I would say that, your own opinion can become idolatry too. It's this is who I am. I'm the person that tells people what they should do.
Right.
And it's that's a dumb identity. I'm sorry.
Well, look at Rush Limbaugh. His entire shtick is talent on loan from God. And I can, win these arguments with half my brain tied behind my back. And that has become his persona. And that persona has warped an entire generation of folks into thinking and believing certain things as a result of this kind of bravado that he puts on with his little shtick. And whether he is being sincere or not, I have no idea. He could just look at himself as a political shock jock who just says things to get a rouse and ratings and make some money and sell some advertisements. I don't know. I don't pretend to know what's in his heart, but you know, it is amazing how that can, you know, really distort us.
Personalities are a huge idol. I think that really sums up a lot of this, because you look at like, well, I mean, first of all, I could make my own personality an idol to me.
Sure.
And it's like, oh, I'm Bridge. I'm the guy that makes people think.
Right. I'm an artist.
I need to make people think, or I'm an artist. I'm going to write something really weird and
I'm a worship leader.
Nobody gets me. That's my identity, is that nobody gets me. And it's like, oh, Bridge, you're so weird. Oh, good. That plays into my identity, right?
Right.
But I mean, like, you talk about Rush Limbaugh, you talk about Hillary Clinton, you talk about, you know, Donald Trump, you talk about, like, there's all these names that are associated with some level of idol worship. And it's like, my gosh, like, if you say anything negative about Donald Trump, it's really interesting to see all the people coming rushing to tell me why I'm wrong about it.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't know if this Trump guy seems like a very good person. And my goodness, my Facebook just blew up because I attacked the vicious attack on Donald Trump's character, right? And they're like, well, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But it's interesting how people can identify with another human being and defend them. I'm trying to think of who's a person that I would do the same thing for. I don't know. Like,
It's weird. It reminds the thing when I see people defending the celebrity politician or the celebrity pastor, like when I used to go to Elevation Church and Stephen Furtick was there doing some pretty nefarious stuff, and I called it out, and some folks said some things pretty negatively to me about how you dare you call off a man of God, or if you call Trump out, you know, well, nobody's perfect and he's not a pastor or what have you, and people will go to the bat for these sort of folks. But it kind of reminds me of like on the playgrounds in school when somebody would tell a yo mama joke, and you would offend somebody over some sort of slur against your mom. Man, don't say anything against my mom. You don't know. Like, we'd take it all personal. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, what does a kid care what some random kid has said about somebody's mom on the playground? That like, you don't know them.
You don't even know who my mom is. So what does this mean?
Right. Yeah. And so, but people will get in fights over it on the schoolyard, or people will get on fights over it on Facebook and Twitter about their favorite celebrity, a person who they've probably even never met. And they'll sit there and say, you know, all sorts of defensive things about that. And I'm like, man, I don't know that I would, you know, ever be that way about anybody I know. If some random stranger started saying weird things about, you know, my mom or my wife or something on Facebook, I would just be like, well, you're weird. I'm not gonna dig it. Why is that riling me up? Except for the fact that, you know, perhaps we feel like if somebody says something negative about our mom or wife or our beloved politician or preacher, then that must negatively reflect on us. Because if you say Donald Trump is dumb, well, since I'm a Trump supporter, that must mean I am dumb. And I've had family members tell me this, huge. Like, and some of my criticism of Trump over the years, and I criticized Obama and I criticized Biden and stuff like that, but never mind all that. The fact I say something about their beloved idol, you know, they have told me that, well, that makes me feel bad because you must think I'm dumb for supporting the dumb guy. And so it's amazing how their identity as a person is somehow tied to that individual. And so, you know, the same thing with your mom is ugly or your mom is fat. Well, that must mean something's wrong with me because, I'm from my mom, and I love her. And so people get riled about those things, and they can't divorce the assault of the person that's beloved to them from themselves, because their identity as a person is so tied up into who that person is, that criticism against them is one and the same.
That's weird though. Like, okay, so like your mom, I mean, that kind of makes sense. Like, I think I notice, like, I think in like relationships, when, like your spouse says something about your mother, it's like you could give the same criticism about your mother, doesn't hurt you. But if your
Right.
spouse says something about your mother, you're like, I don't like this, and like, I think maybe it's because you have that relationship with your spouse, so that makes it a lot more meaningful.
Sure.
But your mother, it's like it makes sense for you to identify at some level with your mother,
Sure.
but like my prime minister or your president, I'm like, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that.
Right.
Um, and I like I'm trying to think, like, what do I identify with that I will like be like, disproportionately offended by.
Right.
I got to really think about this. Like, what are my idols? I was thinking about like, even, like you talk about COVID and, a bunch of the symptoms that you can have from it. And I think one of the things that scares me the most is this idea of cognitive impairment, because I've just discovered that I really like my brain. And it's like, what would it be like if I lost some of my cognitive, functionality?
Sure.
And I was thinking about it. I'm like, okay, like I don't have the greatest memory in the world, but I'm very much a deep thinker. And if I lost my deep thinking, I'm like, I wonder if my depression would go away. I don't know. Like I like to try to look at the positive of things, but yeah, as far as identity goes, it's like we can have our identity in such shallow things. Okay, I'm going to read the psalm that you added to the notes, and then maybe we'll wrap up. We could look at these idols again a little bit just to see how that aligns with the scripture. But Psalm 115, their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throat. Those who make them will become like them, everyone who trusts in them. Wow. That's a scary thought. That last bit, those who make them will become like them.
Very sobering warning.
So it's like comfort, self, personal liberty, power, significance, ministry, theology, money, capitalism, wokeism, identity, founding fathers, and politicians. It's actually interesting, like, to think that you can become like them. And at some level, there's something false about that idol, and it's like, Oprah knows me. No, she doesn't. She doesn't know you. I know she's in your living room, but she doesn't know you. Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing, like the things that we worship, how we ultimately become like the thing that we worship. And while Psalm 115 might be talking about, physical idol, something that
Right.
maybe we can't identify with anymore in our times, because we're either Christians or pagans, or not pagans, but Christians or atheists,
Yeah.
or somewhere in between. Like, we don't really, except for maybe you go to a Chinese restaurant and you see a little Buddha statue with some incense burning in it. We don't usually think of idols. But I still think that the metaphorical idols that we have in our culture today, it's amazing how much that can become all consuming for us. Whether, like, let's talk about like homosexuals or something, somebody whose identity is all about their expression and self-understanding of their human sexuality, and their identity as a gay person, or even as somebody who is, you know, heterosexual and fully straight. It's amazing. Like, you know, I've seen very straight people get very uncomfortable around gay people.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
kind of, you know, and it's amazing just how much that starts warping our personalities or shaping our personalities when we fully embrace something as central as that to being a huge part of our identity and what we are. Or I am a Republican and I'm a conservative, and it doesn't matter who gets in office. I'm going to vote for the Republican or conservative, even if that guy is Donald Trump, who is not Republican and who isn't a conservative, by the way. But it doesn't matter. He's Republican, so I'm going to vote the jersey every single time. And no matter what good or bad thing he does, I'm going to do nothing but sing his praise anyway. And so we play all those games with everything, or money. We look at money, and in order to project, or in order to be successful, you have to project success. And so you know, like somebody who becomes a lawyer or a doctor, they have to keep up the appearances, because nobody wants to have a lawyer that represents them that shows up in an 85 Honda Civic that has 300,000 miles on it. We want the lawyer who shows up in the Lincoln Town Car or the BMW and say, that's my lawyer over there. You know, we don't want, we have this image, we want to maintain it. And we end up becoming, I think, characters of whatever it is we would say we believe in, and that whatever represents us, all in our pursuit of centering everything we have on that thing. In the end, we kind of become a joke. Just as the psalm warns, we become a caricature of the thing that we say is the thing we're about. And I think that's sad.
See, I'm thinking now, I'm like, I really like my nice guy image. So like, if I ever lose that, I'm like really worried.
Right.
So maybe that's my idol, is my nice guy image. Food for thought, my friends.
Absolutely.
Huh. Those who make them will become like them. Well, thank you, Jimmy. Was there anything else you wanted to say about idols?
No, I think I've said all I got to say about it tonight.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah.
Go to jimmystable.com.
Absolutely.
Or more Jimmy. If you want more Jimmy.
All the Jimmy you can get, I will give to you.
You can get all the Jimmy at jimmystable.com.
That's not meant to be X-rated. I hope everybody understands.
What is it, like fans only? It's not a fans only page.
Right, it's not a fans only page.
What do the kids call it? Is it fans only? I don't know.
I'm not one of the cool kids. I learned that a long time ago.
OnlyFans page. I was like, OnlyFans page, where people are always like coming up with this thing for their OnlyFans page and like making it not porn. I'm like, I have an OnlyFans page where I explain to my kids, you know, what podcast I just listened to.
You know, I've tried to think about how I could monetize my podcast at jimmystable.com, and I've thought about like, what could I put behind a paywall? And I'm like, I don't know what I would put behind a paywall that anybody would want to pay for, or that I could successfully sell to anybody. So I'm just going to give it away all for free, where you know. So I'm just going to tell everybody everything I know about whatever I want to talk about on any given week. And if you know they want to look up my address and send me a check in the mail, I'll take that. But I'm a big bad banker, so make the check big.
Well, maybe
make it more than 75 cents.
Well, when COVID's gone, I could like have like kind of a Patreon, or you know, where it's like I'll actually come over to your house and we'll have a conversation that needs to be had.
Fantastic. That sounds like great. It would probably take a lot of money to get you from up there in Canada down here to Charlotte area.
I'd make it worth your while, Jimmy.
Would you make some poutine for me?
Sure. All right. Well, thanks again, Jimmy.
Thanks, John.
Air smudge.